Welcome to the first installment of the biomechanics series. In this part, we are going to go over all the basic principles with simple explanations and demonstrations. This is going to give our All Access Pass subscribers the foundation to help identify weaker technical deficiencies in their own skiing. Understanding which muscles and movements create what techniques is the first step and of utmost importance in helping you understand your own technique, and also which exercises and progressions from our other videos will help you improve. That is the idea of this video, to give our followers even more knowledge and understanding of how to improve the finer details of their own skiing. There is a huge amount of information packed into a small space, and it is meant to be used as a reference point for all of our other videos and used alongside them also. All the movements will be explained with medical terminology you would hear in a physiotherapist or doctor's office to keep it as international as possible. I tried to keep this intricate topic as simple as I could. This first part should give you a great understanding of biomechanics and how they relate to our ski techniques. I hope you enjoy. Core foundational movements. What good ski course would it be without a good acronym? So we can call them CFMs. Flexion and extension, internal and external rotations, abduction and adduction, pronation and supination. I want to cover flexion and extension movements first and dive into why these are so important. With understanding these movements, it really creates a 3D model of what the rest of the body does while skiing. Adding certain amounts of flexion in certain joints changes how the rest of the movements behave in relationship to each other. Ankles and dorsiflexion and plantar flexion are a good example. Unlike every other movement we do in day-to-day life and other sports, skiing is unique in the fact that our ankles have been extremely compromised in their range. With a correct fitted ski boot and flex for a high level of skiing, we are only getting up to a few degrees of movement at most. Most boots are sitting around 16 degrees of dorsiflexion, which sets the precedent for the next joints and their flexion movements and every other movement. What other activities do we do where we have a hard plastic cast on our leg restricting movement and placing us into a permanently dorsiflex position? Imagine going to play tennis with a ski boot on. It wouldn't work. This is why skiing is so unique, and comparing skiing with other activities that allow a full range of dorsiflexion and plantar flexion and ankle function are not good parallels. And for me, personally, it's like comparing apples and oranges. We don't train running techniques with ski boots on, just like we don't train ski techniques without sticking to the ski boot parameters and ski ranges. When we are thinking of cross-training, we need to start preparing movements that keep our ankles in similar ranges. As you will see, this greatly affects the rest of the movements. Knee flexion and extension. Knee flexion and extension movements are some of the biggest ranges of movements we create when skiing. For example, in moguls where the knees come up nearly to the chest. Filming with all the projected athletes on the same slope with similar skis all doing similar turns is great for reviewing and comparing all these techniques. This gives you a good sample size to take averages. Just taking one screenshot of a turn here and there on different snow, different skis, different hill is useless at getting good data. So looking over many runs on the same slope, bringing in many constants was a great tool at looking over averages. I have watched over all the videos countless times collecting data on this, which gives a great picture of where the most dynamic skiing happens. Throughout most turns, the ranges go from 75 degrees of knee flexion to around 140 degrees of knee flexion. More or less than these numbers are extremely rare and are outliers. So knowing this sets our markers for the next movement. Hip flexion. In reality, we only ever really ski in hip flexion, as true hip extension is having the leg bend back past the body. So we only ever ski within ranges of hip flexion, which are 110 degrees and 55 degrees from observing on the videos. Hip flexion is extremely important and is actually where the majority of steering or breaking the ski off a carving path happens. I'll get more in depth with this a little later. Spinal flexion and extension. Spinal flexion is something that I do not recommend using in skiing. It will happen naturally through load, but I recommend keeping it as close to neutral as possible. Creating bend through the spine while under load can create disc stress. Spinal flexion will happen as skiing is dynamic and we get pushed through ranges we shouldn't all the time by the nature of the sport. But training proper squat, deadlift and core stability exercises should help minimize excessive spinal flexions. So where and when do these flexion and extension movements happen in the turn? Well, let's break one down. I've always thought of turns in two parts: transition and shaping. Transition is where the skis start flattening from one turn to the point where they are tipped onto the opposite edges at the top of the next turn. Shaping is where they are tipped on the edge to create a turn shape until you want to start the next turn transition. Pretty simple, right? So after reviewing all the athletes and watching thousands of other high-level skiers, the most flexion happened at the transition, and the most extension happens through the shaping, with the most extended part being at the load part of the turn, or the load phase. Without getting too much into physics in this episode, I'll give a rough guide as to where and when that happens. The most loaded part of the turn also happens to be where the inside leg is the most flexed as well. So the outside half of the body is more extended than the inside half. The most loaded part of the turn is always changing, depending on steepness, snow conditions, edge angle, speed, intent of turn, and many other variables. The transition is always the least loaded part, as the ski edge is flattened and the resistance against centrifugal forces stopped and momentum takes over. We'll have a physics episode to explain all of these more in depth later on, so stay tuned. Essentially, we want to be in an extended body position to deal with the force, but being extended limits range of movement in some areas. A certain amount of flex lets the lower body create edge angles, but in this position you cannot deal with as much load. These are compromises, and that's why timing of these movements are so critical. Internal and external rotations. Femoral internal and external rotations. Femoral internal and external rotations I find are some of the most misunderstood topics in general ski instruction and coaching. Most English-speaking instructor organisations talk about rotation of the femur as a twisting of the ski, and this would be true if we skied with no dorsiflexion, knee flexion or hip flexion. This is why I wanted to talk about the flexion of the joints first, to give parameters to describe all the next movements. In a neutral human position, straight up and down, internal and external rotations would just affect the ski tip and tail twisting from one side to the other. But like we know, we never stand like this while skiing, and as soon as we add flexion, and internal and external rotations act totally differently on our skis. As we go through our ranges of flexion, they also change. Pure internal or external rotations are next to impossible just to isolate while skiing, and we are always coupling them with other movements. But for the sake of this video, we'll just look at them as individually as possible. If you visit a physio and they measure your internal and external rotations, they'll do it while you are seated, with 90 degrees of flexion in the knee and at the hip. Normal ranges are up to 40 degrees of internal and up to 50 degrees of external. This internal rotation test shows the relationship of what happens to our leg in a ski position. That would emulate where we could be in the transition of a short turn. If we just isolate pure internal rotation of the outside ski, the femur in this flex position results in a pure lateral edging movement and should not displace the tip or tail of the ski. External rotation will edge the ski to the outside of the foot. As we go through our range of extension, there is no point through our dynamic skiing stance that internal and external rotations of the femur don't act as an edging movement. It isn't until we get into a much more extended position that it acts as a ski twisting agent. Having permanent dorsiflexion, and as a result we need to have permanent amount of knee flexion to stay in balance, but as you can see in this range it makes internal and external rotations of the femur act as an edging movement, not a twisting movement. The internal rotator muscles are pretty weak anyway, so at the transition where there is much less load and forces acting on the body is where they can be utilised in their most efficient way. In skiing the result looks like knee angulation. Edge rolls are a good example of this. Torso rotations of the pelvis. Pelvis rotations, or also known in the ski instruction as hip rotation and counter rotation, is prominent using hip stabilizers and the same muscles as internal and external rotations of the femur, obliques, back muscles and core. Having control of these movements are good for correcting balance while skiing. Note that the direction of the hips will greatly affect pronation and supination movements of the foot, and this is important as it will give you the limitations as to when and where these movements should happen during specific turns. Torso rotations and shoulder rotations. Shoulder rotations, or more commonly known as upper body rotation. The main area of torque is generally located through the thoracic spine. You will see prominent external shoulder rotation in GS skiing as they block the gate. These movements in normal dynamic free skiing are generally used for micro adjustments in balance to align the center of mass up against centripetal force. But excessive upper body rotations are a common mistake for beginners and intermediates and can drastically throw you out of balance. These torso rotations are generally coupled with spinal flexions as well, which creates twisting and bending through the spine while under extreme load, which in general day-to-day activities is highly dangerous and a recipe for blowing out a disc. Learning to minimize these movements to a more neutral position and skiing in safer ranges is important. They will happen as skiing is so dynamic, but minimizing them is the key. Abduction and adduction. Abduction is also quite an interesting topic and misunderstood. This movement and the muscles that create abduction are actually the main muscles responsible for what people call hip angulation. Also upper body inclination and leveling of the hip in relationship to our outside ski. We talk about leveling of the hip in our videos a lot, so this should explain further on this topic. Obviously there are other muscles involved, like the QL and many more, but the majority of this movement is accessed through the hip stabilizers. Like all the other movements, how much flexion in the joints will greatly influence what happens. And in certain flexion ranges while skiing, abduction is the most often coupled with femoral internal rotation. If our hips are rotated inside the turn or outside the turn, this can start compounding either femoral internal rotation or external rotations. Through the shaping phase of the turn, and especially the loaded part of the turn, abduction acts as a leveling of the hip, giving us control of micro adjustments to balance over the outside ski. How much we need is always changing depending on all the other variables, so there is never a set amount, but knowing how to access it and its full range is important so we can choose how much appropriate for the circumstance. In a longer carve turn, for example, you may have to adjust the level of your hip through the turn depending on the snow conditions and the variables. Generally, it is used at the start of the shaping phase until the end of the shaping phase in the hope of being able to align your center of mass against centripetal force in a lateral sense. Adduction. Adduction through the turn generally happens when the outside leg is abducted. So when the outside ski and leg has abducted, the inside leg should have adducted. Just like with femoral internal and external rotations, while skiing parallel turns, the inside and the outside leg are doing opposite movements. For the sake of keeping it simple in part 1, we will stop here, as when compounding all the movements together through the turn, it starts getting more complicated. So in part 2, when we start combining all the movements, we'll get more in depth with all the compound movements. Part 1 is just to explain the basics. Pronation and supination. Pronation and supination are also a very interesting topic, and I wanted to talk about this last as they connect all the movements together nicely. When we look at these movements, we need to know how much pronation and supination we actually use while skiing. This is quite tricky as everyone's boots fit totally different, so what I can do is show you the ranges my boots allow, and this should give you a guideline as to how much there can be. There will be people with a little more movement and a little less movement than this, but generally you'll see a rough guide as to how much our plastic casts allow us to move. Just like dorsiflexion and plantarflexion ranges, pronation and supination is also extremely limited compared to other day-to-day sports. Open and closed chain pronation and supination are also important to note, but can explain relationship of what the leg and foot do, and also emulate different things that happen in skiing. For example, if we change the edges while we're in the air, we are in open chain, and when we are grounded, we are in closed chain. Like many things in skiing, the lines get very blurry, as if we absorb pressure to transition from one turn to the next, we are floating, and no perceived pressure is on the body. Are we actually in open or closed chain? Or somewhere in between? With every technique in skiing, lines are very muddy. Pronation of the foot is generally combined with dorsiflexion, abduction of the forefoot, and eversion of the calcaneus or heel. When it is in a closed chain position, this results in the talus pointing into the turn and internal rotation of the leg. That is why pronation is so important, as it edges the ski. As we know, getting our edges in is an extremely important part of skiing. Supination of the foot in open chain is generally coupled with plantarflexion, adduction of the forefoot, and inversion of the calcaneus. So the old steer your feet that people say will actually flatten the ski. If you lead with your toes in and through the turn, this is forefoot adduction, which is coupled with supination and external rotation of the leg. Keeping the ski on the edge actually requires the forefoot to point outside of the turn, or should I say muscle engagement to abduct the foot, as the boot won't allow that movement to happen exactly. The ankle and the talus are actually what will point inside the turn. But as you know from how much movement our boots allow, it isn't really that much. Wow, so that was probably a lot of information condensed into 20 minutes. Please re-watch many times and pause to read all the diagrams. I wanted to keep it moving, and this video is designed to be paused. We don't need to remember all the muscles, that is not really important, but the main takeaway is what movement creates what result on the skis, so we can start emulating ski movements and help diagnose our own mistakes. I used as many medical terms as I could in this movie, so you can go away and read up on these movements more in depth. There is so much more information out there if you really want to understand all the muscle insertions and intricacies of these movements. This is just the basics of ski movements. Here is a chart just to summarize what each movement is and what they do in our skiing as a quick basic overview of what we've just talked about. I hope you guys enjoyed.